Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
The word sacrifice is loaded with power, and with media pundits discussing the great sacrifice being made not only by first responders, healthcare workers, but all those brave souls saving lives by sitting in a basement and watching Netflix, perhaps it's time to examine what real sacrifice actually is. A recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll asked Americans if they thought the COVID-19 crisis was the greatest public tragedy faced by Americans. They listed other events such as Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the 2008 crash, and even the JFK assassination. 37% said it was. That's an unbelievable figure for what amounts to a disease that effectively kills less than seasonal flu. But perhaps they were talking about the hardships endured by all Americans. When the planes took down the Twin Towers, the direct effect was mostly on New Yorkers. Yes, the event rocked the very heart of the nation, but individuals could still go out with friends, get coffee, sit in the park and reflect on what had happened. Pearl Harbor seems such a long time ago, and again, there was one group of people more impacted than any other, those who died in the initial attack and then those who went off to war. Yes, people lost family and friends, but the day-to-day living, although different, still allowed the basic freedoms of being able to take a walk around your neighborhood at the very least. Perhaps this is why a media determined to turn this coronavirus into the defining moment of our generation, of our lifetime, because it does affect everyone. However, the hyperbole involved and the talk of sacrifice really appears to smack of desperation for a hot, all-encompassing story. Today I want to talk about real sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that lives on generation after generation. Not the staying on your couch kind of sacrifice, but stories, true events that will live on and inspire us and inspire the generations to come long after we've passed. Tales of sacrifice are so unique in that we each picture ourselves as the protagonist and are forced to confront our inner hearts and ask the question of ourselves, would I have the moral courage and bravery to lose it all in the name of a principle, a loved one, an idea, or an ideal? Even just hearing stories of sacrifice actually makes us better people because they urge us to examine our basest fears and motivations. On this edition of The Rabbit Hole, I'm going to discuss 2 episodes of sacrifice that specifically fit in with the present-day crisis. Now, throughout history, time after time, there have been huge sacrifices, moving events, of which, and arguably the most important, would be that of Jesus. But I want to talk to you about events that may surprise you, that may intrigue you, and maybe, just maybe, help give some real perspective on what's happening today. When we hear about sacrifices made for the greater good, all too often it's a case of an heroic individual making the offering of his or her life for the sake of others. But the first story I want you to think of actually involves the sacrifice of a whole village. It began in 1665 in the village of Eyam in the north of England, not far from Sheffield. The Black Death was at the height of its power, running rampant across Europe and parts of England. Up until now, though, Eyam had being a secluded village, had survived intact. It's thought that a bolt of cloth arriving from London had fleas in it, and those fleas, of course, carried death with them. The tailor who handled the fabric died first, and then others followed. Over the period of just a few weeks, about 40 souls had succumbed. Now, knowing full well that any one of them could be next, the villagers prepared to flee to nearby towns and cities that were not plague-infested. Now, we might think of those who lived hundreds of years ago as more simple of mind, but the village clergyman, William Mompesson, he understood all too well that if these folks left, they would take the plague with them, spreading disease and death to all those who they encountered. So he set out and achieved the seemingly impossible. He convinced all 800 people to stay right where they were. Now remember, this included mothers with their children, husbands with their wives, families, friends, all willing to take the chance that they would die, the very real chance that they would die, in order to save others, at the cost of their own loved ones. Would you do the same? Could you? They stayed put, and by the summer of 1666 there were around 5 deaths a day. Every single day. By the time the plague burned itself out, it's estimated that around 260 of the 800 villages had succumbed to the Black Death. This was a higher mortality rate than even London. But they came through the other side. They had lost family and friends, neighbours and parents. They put those they loved most in the world and themselves on the sacrificial altar, all for the sake of strangers. This is what courage looks like. Interestingly enough, William Mompesson was one of the survivors. Another tale of sacrifice that forces us to ask ourselves if we understand what the word really means took place in a lot more recent history, during the siege of Leningrad that lasted 900 days. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis had created a military blockade that had left the entire city cut off from supplies. It's estimated that around 1 million people died during this, 90% of which through starvation. Now, Adolf Hitler knew that militarily he probably couldn't easily win a straight fight, so he sought the cruelest of victories. In September 1941, the Führer Hitler, he issued Directive number 1601 stating that St. Petersburg must be erased from the face of the earth, and we have no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. By November, his strategy was clear and decided. He said during a speech in Munich, "Leningrad must die of starvation." During the siege, about 1.5 million people fled Leningrad to escape almost certain fate. But there was one group that refused to leave. At the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, a collection of crops, plants and seeds had been gathered. Now these were specifically designed to be crops that could survive in extreme conditions. And in fact, it's from this very collection that many of today's crops are related. In America and around the world, they were genetically modified to be hardy and resist pests. It's fair to say that almost every person alive today has in some way benefited from this initial collection of crops. The scientists running the institute were faced with an impossible choice. They could flee and save themselves, consigning the crops to who knows what end. They could outlast the siege and survive by eating the crops or some of the crops. Or they could slowly starve to death, sitting on literally tons of food, potatoes, rice, nuts, all in an effort to preserve something of value for the future, for an unknown future. Which would you choose? Alexander Shukin and Dmitry Ivanov and a handful of other scientists chose to slowly starve to death, surrounded by mountains of food, all for the sake of an unknown and unknowable future. We have to ask ourselves, how long could we ourselves hold out? Would we break early and decide that we must keep our strength to preserve perhaps just some of the crops? Would we finally break when we saw our colleagues perish, knowing full well that we ourselves would not be far behind them? Well, they didn't break. They chose the benefit to future generations over their own lives. And what makes this sacrifice so moving is that their deaths would have been so slow and torturous. Perhaps we can all imagine sacrificing ourselves in a blaze of glory, but to waste away so painfully, so tormented when your salvation is just one decision away, one hand reaching out to save yourself. It's unimaginable what they must have gone through. When the siege was broken, all the seeds, all the plants, all the crops were intact and accounted for. Every single one. The sacrifices we're being asked to make today are not even on the same scale as these true stories we've just covered. I'm reminded of what J.D. Salinger wrote in The Catcher in the Rye. The mark of an immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of a mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one. In the wake of this coronavirus, as we look at sacrifices we each have to make, perhaps it's better not to see ourselves as making heroic gestures and equating our minor inconvenience with true suffering endured by many throughout the ages. Perhaps we just need to be a little more humble.
The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production.
Available at Libsyn, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, on Roku, and other fine podcast providers.